Welcome back to Z-Speed and thanks for tuning back in. Today we're going to be installing an Innovate Motorsport air-fuel ratio gauge into our A-pillar on the 350Z. So if this is something you're interested in, stay tuned and we'll get right on it. Now, before we get started with the install, let's briefly go over the reasons why you would even want to install an air-fuel ratio gauge into your 350Z. And this really only applies to the 2003 and the early 2004 models, the DE. And it really does not apply to the later 04 and up models. And the problem is with the ECU output data. So the output data is missing the air-fuel ratio readings. And if you're going to get an aftermarket E-tune like I am, I chose UpRev, you're going to have an air-fuel ratio reading to do the UpRev tune. So right away, UpRev called me back when I set my first data logs in and they said, hey, Z-Speed, we got a problem. We don't have any air-fuel ratio readings. We can't do an E-tune without it. So you only have two options. One is to add an aftermarket air-fuel ratio gauge or take it to a dyno and then give us the results. Well, that kind of negates the whole reason for an UpRev E-tune, so I chose to go ahead and install an air-fuel ratio gauge. So if you're wondering, hey, do I have one of these early 04 350Zs? There's an easy way to tell. Just open up your door jamb and there's a couple stickers in there and it's the sticker right on top. And even though this is a 2004 350Z, it was assembled here in July of 03. So this is definitely an early 04 350Z. I would consider anything before May or June of 2004 to be an early 04 350Z, and you may have this problem with missing the data for the air-fuel ratio readings. So you will probably have to contact your e-tuner to find out more information. Okay, before we get started with the install, let's see what's in the box. What's in the box? What's in the box? What movie does that come from? Let's see what's in the Innovate Motorsport box. Its gauge is actually nicely wrapped in some bubble wrap here, as you can see, and that keeps it from getting scratched up. And it's a very high quality gauge, and it's got LEDs all across the face, so it's very easy to read while you're driving. And that is a nice little setup. You can see the electrical harness on there, and we'll be going over that later. Here is the O2 sensor plug-in, and it's really long, so we can pretty much place it anywhere we want on the exhaust, and that's nice. I had to buy this little attachment right here for my laptop, and that's an aftermarket. Innovate sells that, and that's how we're going to get data to our laptop from the Innovate gauge, and that just plugs into this harness that attaches to the gauge itself. So yeah, you will have to purchase this right here if you're doing an E-tune. And we also get some extra faces, a silver face right here, and an Innovate sticker. We also have an O2 bung that comes with it. This is not the one that actually came with it. I'll be going over that though a little bit later. This is an extra one I had in my box. And so yeah, this is a very high quality, and UpRev E-tune actually recommends that you get this gauge if you have to buy one. So let's begin this install with the placement of the O2 sensor. Now, Innovate Motorsports recommends that you place this sensor in the left or right header before the catalytic converter. They say if you place it after the catalytic converter, you'll end up with skewed values towards a lean reading. And that really doesn't affect me here because I'm running test pipes already. Motordyne ARC pipes to be exact. So I will be placing this O2 sensor in my Y pipe. I'm going to place it after the right and left header gases converge so I get the most accurate reading possible. Now I do have some good news if you're still running your catalytic converter. I still believe you can run it in your Y pipe, and this is the reason why. Even if you're sending your values in and they're a little bit leaner than they should be, and you get back a tune that's much richer than normal, it's okay because it's much better to run a richer tune than a lean tune. A rich tune will keep the detonation in the cylinder head itself much cooler than a lean tune will. It also decreases knock, gives you a little more power, obviously. I'm not an expert at all on this as far as lean tune versus rich tune, but you can research it yourself. It looks like a rich tune is much better to run than a lean tune. So you can also contact Innovate and ask them for their advice as well. Now that I've got the Y pipe removed from the exhaust system, we can begin the removal of the heat shield. We'll have to do this to place the O2 sensor and to drill a hole into the side to place the O2 bung. So one of the problems is that this thing's been heat soaked for many years and it's got quite a bit of rust on the 10 mil bolts that go all the way around this heat shield. So you're gonna have to spray them all down with some PB Blaster and let them soak for a good 20-30 minutes. If you don't do this, when you go to remove these 10 mil bolts, there's a high probability that one or two of them will snap or break in some form or other, and that's the last thing you want. Unless you have new hardware, be very careful with this. Okay, you can see here that I've successfully removed the heat shield in here, and I did not destroy any of the hardware, and that's always nice. So now we can get a good look at our Y pipe and decide exactly where we're going to be placing the O2 sensor. You can see here at this point, both the right and left header gases converge into this area, and that's precisely where I want to place my O2 sensor after the gases mix together. I want to place this in a 9 o'clock position or a 3 o'clock position. Now I got my sensor laid over here in the 9 o'clock position, so I'm going to kind of decide exactly where I want to place this, and it's going to be after this Y conversion here. So after looking under the car, this spot right here looks like a good place to place the sensor so that it doesn't bump up against anything underneath the car. Of course, I'll have to cut a hole in the heat shield to accommodate the sensor as well. The good news is this metal's pretty thin and we should be able to easily cut out a spot for the sensor. And so I've decided to go ahead and place it right about here, and first thing I'll need to do is get a center punch and punch a hole right here so that we can actually get a drill bit and put a guide hole into the pipe first. Then we can come back with a larger drill bit and start to try to get it to the perfect size for the O2 bung. Now you can see I've got my foot on this pipe so it doesn't slide around. I'm gonna get my mallet out here and put a nice center punch in here, and I've got a good one right here. Now I can get a regular metal drill bit here and place a guide hole in the side of the pipe. Once you get yourself a nice guide hole, you can go ahead and begin drilling out the hole to the appropriate size. You can see right here now I've got the Innovate Motorsport O2 bung. It's quite long. It's a little bit different than your standard O2 bung, so make sure that you only use the O2 bung that comes with the Innovate Motorsport gauge here. You can see I'm just slowly going here and drilling a hole, and I'm basically trying to match the inner diameter of this O2 bung. You don't want to make it too large to where the actual O2 bung slides into the Y pipe. So just take your time and go slow until you can get this hole to match the inner diameter. As you can see right here, I've just about got the inner diameter matched up perfect. It may be just a hair under sized, but I'd rather it be a little undersized than oversized, and I'm going to actually take it into a shop to have it welded. And if they think that it needs to be a little bit larger, they can go ahead and do it there at the shop. But yeah, this is looking pretty good here. I'm gonna stop right here. Now, as you can see, before I take this in to have the O2 bung welded in, I've got a lot of rust that needs to be removed. I mean, this thing has definitely seen better days. It's pretty old. It's the original manufactured equipment. So I'm gonna grab this wire wheel and I'm going to pretty much go to town and try to get as much rust off as possible. You can see I've got a lot of carbon buildup as well, and these flanges are quite rusty. So I'm gonna try to smooth these down as best I can so I get a really good seal, and that'll eliminate a lot of your exhaust leaks as well. So I wanted you to pay special attention though to these two bolts. You need to put some painter's tape or guard them somehow so that you don't damage the threads if you're going to use a wire wheel on this stuff. Now on the outside of it, you can take your time and get as much rust off as possible. There's nothing really to hurt on the outside of this pipe. So, you know, go to town on it, clean it up as best you can. Now as far as the other two surfaces that made up to your catalytic converters or your test pipes, you can see there is no bolt on this side, so you can really get in there and smooth these out quite nicely. Now it's time to spray paint our wide pipe with some high temperature paint. I've got some nice paint that I picked up from O'Reilly's, 1300 to 2000 degrees Fahrenheit is what they claim it can handle. Hope it works. Cole's job here is now to make sure that I spray 2 thick solid coats on this thing so that we keep the rust from reforming. Also, I'm going to pay special attention to the ends here where it mounts up to the exhaust and where it also mounts up to the catalytic converters or the test pipes, whichever you're running, just so that we can get a nice flush fit with our new gaskets and avoid any more exhaust leaks. So take your time and make sure you spray your wide pipe down thoroughly. Now that I'm all done painting it, it's time to have my O2 bung welded into the wide pipe. Now, I don't know how to do any welding, so I'm going to take it up to my local automotive shop here, and this is Whitlow's Automotive. Actually, they specialize only in exhaust. Great crew up here. They're very friendly, and they really gave me a good deal that should run you about 20 to 25, 30 bucks to have an O2 bung welded in. You can see their shop's really neat. They've got a lot of interesting stuff all throughout their shop. So the manager of Whitlow's took a look at my O2 bung, and the first thing he said was, "Hey, this isn't our standard O2 bung." And I said, "I realize that. This is a specialty item for a gauge." So he said, "Okay, we'll weld it in, not a problem. I just wanted you to know that's not our standard O2 bung." There we go. So we got my buddy here. What's your name?
Garter.
Garter's gonna go ahead and do a professional weld for me since I have no idea what I'm doing. And these guys have got it down pat, but he's gonna come on in here and weld my bung in right now. I'm not gonna look. So they had me come into the office where they're doing the weld so I wouldn't get exposed to the welding light, and these guys did a bang up job. It was spot on, and I would highly recommend Whitlow's if you're in the Hueytown, Alabama area. Real nice group of guys up here. Now that I'm back from the shop, it's time to reassemble the heat shield onto the wide pipe. Cole's come over to inspect the weld. He gave it 2 paws up, said everything looks good. I'm clear to go ahead and place the heat shielding back on. But before I can replace the heat shield, I'm definitely going to have to cut a notch out to accommodate this new O2 bung. You can see it's pretty thin metal, so it shouldn't be too bad. Now on this side, you can see I've removed the fiberglass inlay because it was just all chewed up. It looked nothing like this side. It was just beat to heck. So I'll replace that with some more aftermarket fiberglass inlay. So next up, we're gonna basically just put the heat shield over the wide pipe, grab a marker and mark out or mock up a little area that we're gonna need to cut out with a Dremel. And then we can hopefully get this heat shield fitted back around the Y pipe and get it ready to install. So all you have to do at this point is put your heat shielding back over your Y pipe, and you can see I grabbed a permanent marker, marked out a spot around the bung, and bigger is probably better than smaller, so you can cut a little bigger chunk out than you think you need. It's not really going to matter. No one's going to really see this, and it'll be easier to be a little bit too large than it would be too small. Now, as I was cutting this, I thought it would cut through really quickly, but it was a little thicker than I thought here, so take your time. It will definitely cut through this if you have a Dremel, but it takes a little bit longer than I originally thought it would. I had to work at it quite a bit. So once I got the two halves cut out, I replaced the heat shielding and bolted it back down after I put the fiberglass inlay on the one piece that was missing, and it pretty much fit like a glove. It was great, no problems with that. So now we're ready to reinstall this whole Y pipe back into the car. Now you can see right here I've got some new gaskets from Z1 Auto Parts. I'm not sponsored by them, but you can see you can send it from Z1 Motorsports that these gaskets are much thicker than the original equipment, and these are some nice aftermarket gaskets. So if you're looking for new gaskets, if you're not going to reuse your original ones, I decided to replace them since I had it all apart. These are some nice thick gaskets. They worked pretty well here. Hats off to Z1 Motorsports. Now that we're finally done with our Y pipe, it's time to install our gauge. Now you will need a mount to place the gauge in and mount it to your A-pillar. Z1 Motorsports, once again, has a nice black gauge mount right here if you have black interior like I do. So I'd highly recommend this, and I'll link the product below. So the plan is to run the wiring from the gauge back behind this vent right here. And it's really actually got quite a bit of room back here to run the wiring, so that's very nice. And it's basically come out right down into this area right here, and then we'll tap the power into the fuse box right here. Now you can see this is an automatic, so I'm missing that pedal, which gives me a lot of room to work with here, but you can still get in here even with if you have a clutch pedal. But we'll be tapping it into the fuse box for power, and then we'll be running our ground wire back behind this boot right here. Now this boot covers your steering column, and the great news is it's pretty easy to remove, and we can run all of our wiring from the gauge through this firewall right behind this boot, and then we can put the boot back over this and it'll be watertight. So it's very nice. We do not have to drill any holes whatsoever. So this is a great setup for us to run our wire through and not have to worry about doing any modifications to the firewall. Now it's time to find a fuse to power our gauge, and luckily we have a little fuse box right down here on the driver's side. I've already removed the shield here so you can see what we're looking at, and I also have this little probe here that you plug into your cigarette lighter, and it turns red if you touch something that's powered. So I've put my keys in the ignition and turned it to accessory mode. So now this fuse box is powered up, and all we have to do now is find an empty fuse slot that has power going to it while the accessory mode's on. And I thought this was a fuse, but it's not. It's just a little blank spot. So here's an empty fuse, and boom, you can see right there, we've got power to this empty fuse right here. So this would be a good choice right here. And I'm gonna look for one more spot, and I'm gonna tap this one, boom. Once again, we've got another fuse that has power to it, and they're both empty. So we could use either one of these to power our gauge. So that's pretty nice. And this is 04, remember that. So if you have a 03, 04, the schematics of your fuse box are probably the same, and you could use either one of these slots here. I'm not sure about 05 and up if the fuse box is exactly the same here or not. Now, I just briefly want to go over the fuse tap that you want to buy, and this is the exact one you need right here. And I'm going to show you one that you don't want. But this one here with the prongs, basically it looks just like a fuse, and you can see where I can add a couple of small fuses right here to use it to trip if something goes wrong. And this is exactly what you don't want. And now this will not fit into your fuse box. I tried this. I got this one from AutoZone. and I got the other one from Advanced. I'm not sure, you know, which of your local shops will have the correct one, but this is the one you're looking for right here. You want it, actually looks like a fuse, and then you add your little fuses on the side once you tap that into the fuse box. Let's briefly go over the wiring schematics here. Of course, red is your power, black is your ground. The white wire is to be hooked up to your headlights so that it dims the gauge at night when the lights come on. I'm really not going to use that. And the yellow wire is a data logger that you could hook up to your ECU or to other devices to collect data. I'm not going to be using that either. I'm going to be using that little wire that I showed you that I purchased earlier to hook up to my laptop to gather the information I need. So, only thing we're going to be using is the black and red wire. So now at this point I've already removed the boot that covers the steering column right here. You can see that. It's got a little rubber seal that goes right around the firewall and a little metal casing that goes around it. It's pretty neat. It's only like 4 10mm bolts to release, and then this whole thing slides back and away from the firewall. You can see I got a nice little space to run my ground wire and my O2 sensor wire right through here. Piece of cake. So what I'm going to do now is grab a bright light, put it up here by the boot so I can crawl underneath the car and fish my wires up from underneath, and then poke them through this little boot area and then pull them through. So that's the plan here. Okay, at this point my car is up on jack stands. I didn't really mention that earlier. And what we're going to do is fish some ground wire, and we're going to fish the O2 sensor wire up into the engine bay. And you can see that bright light right there. That's what we're shooting for. That is a light that I put inside the driver's side compartment down there to shine, so we'll know where that little boot is. So what I've done now is I've got a nice thick wire about the consistency of a coat hanger. So if you don't have a wire like this, you can use a coat hanger and just straighten it out. And what I've done is I've bought some extra wire to attach to my ground wire from my gauge, because the ground wire from the gauge is not quite long enough. So you definitely need some extra length for your ground wire. You'll have to extend your ground wire from your gauge, and I've taped that on there. Plus I've taped the O2 sensor wire onto this metal wire, and I'm going to basically fish it through into the cabin right through here. I'm just going to kind of follow the light until I can get it up in there. Then I'll crawl from underneath the car and get back into the driver's side, and then just grab a hold of this wire and pull the wire through. Now you could also go the opposite direction. You could start off in the engine bay and try to get the wire down into underneath the car, but whichever way you want to tackle it, I just thought it would be easier for me to go underneath and fish it up into the driver's side. So whichever way you want to go. Now I've run my cables through this area and I've tightened the boot back down. You can see I've tucked all my cables behind this carpet padding right here, and there's little slits in this padding that makes it really easy to run them through. And right here is a slit that was already in there, so I just ran my cables right through here. So now we can run those up to the dashboard. But yeah, you can see everything's neatly tucked away, and you want to make sure that those wires are behind this padding so that it doesn't interfere with your driving and it stays away from your feet. So you can see just a little bit of the wire right here. But yeah, this boot fit back nicely and it was a really good seal. So you really can't beat this. So now that we've got our wire up through the boot and it's placed back on, now we're ready to take this wire and run it up to the dashboard. So you can see I've got it right here, and we're going to fish it up through the dashboard in a second. So now it's time to remove the A-pillar, and before we can do that, we have to remove some of this weather stripping right here. Not all of it, just enough to get to the A-pillar. And what we really want to do is we're going to get behind the A-pillar. So you can see there's a nice little gap right here. We can get our fingers back behind this gap, and we can start to tug at this A-pillar and pop it loose. Now you want to tug towards the top of this thing because that's where the clips are. And once we remove it, you'll see that we should have quite a bit of room back here to run our wiring up and through here, and then we can run it through the A-pillar here. So Yeah, this looks pretty good. I don't think we'll have to remove any part of the dash. We'll see what happens. So now you can see I've actually removed the A-pillar, and there's some factory wiring that runs all the way up the side of this window frame right here. So we still have plenty of room though to run our wires from our gauge, but you want to apply most of your force up here. Here is one of the little tabs, fits in there, and here's the other one. So apply most of your pressure up in this area, and that should assure that you don't damage this pillar when you're removing it. The bottom of the pillar just slides right out of this area. Now that I've removed the A-pillar, I've laid a little light down in the floorboard, and I'm looking down through the A-pillar area. You can see we've got ample room all through this area to place our wiring from the gauge and run it down to our fuse box. So we really don't have to worry about taking the dashboard apart any further than this, and any excess cable that we have, we can wind it up and tuck it safely back behind here. So this is great. We don't have to worry about disassembling anything else at this point, and we can get on with the gauge install. Now it's time for us to mock up a position to place our gauge pod into the A-pillar. You can see I've taped off a little area here, and I've actually got a little pin and marked a spot where the gauge pod wires should slide through. Now this is kind of up to you at this point. You have a little leeway, so choose an area and then mark it off. So at this point, I just laid my gauge pod on the A-pillar, and I was able to see exactly where the wires were going to need to go through the A-pillar. I'm going to grab one of these cone-style drill bits here and start a guide hole first, since I've figured out exactly where the wires are going to be touching the A-pillar. And then we're going to come back in at a 90-degree angle, because all these wires come in at an angle from the gauge pod, and a straight hole through the A-pillar will not allow the gauge pod to sit flush. So we have to come in at an angle to accommodate the way the wiring comes through the gauge pod. Now that I've got my pilot hole completed, I can come in at a 90-degree angle, and this should allow the wiring from the gauge pod to seat correctly so that we don't bunch it up and cause the gauge pod to kind of lift up off the A-pillar. So just take your time here and make sure that you get the correct angle. So if you're wondering how large to make the hole, basically what I did was run a hole through at a 90-degree angle, then grab my gauge pod wiring, slip it into the hole, and if it was too small, I went back and widened it a little more. I did that a couple times till I got it just right. Now that you got the hole to the correct size, we can go ahead and remove these little two ribs right here that are behind the hole. You can see there's a bunch of ribs to give this A-pillar stability. And once you drill that hole out, you need to remove these two last little ribs. Just grab a pair of wire snips, you can clip those, and that'll make it really easy to get our wiring harness through this area. Now I'm briefly going to show you some of the wiring that I've run through the dash and up towards the gauge pod. Right here is our power wire in the red right here. And we also have a ground wire right here. And this right here is the wiring that attaches to the back of the gauge pod, and that gives us all the data for our O2 readings. And I talked about that earlier, where that just basically hooks to a laptop, and this right here is the other end right here. So we can coil that up and tuck that away later, and we can just pull it out when we need it. And we also still have to run our O2 cable through the dashboard. I haven't done that yet. It's still laying on the floorboard. Now let's take a look at the gauge. I've actually slid it into the pod, and it's got a nice little mount that comes with the gauge, this little aluminum bracket, and it's got two thumb screws, and you can just slip the bracket over the back. That'll keep it nice and tight into the gauge pod, and you can tighten those thumb screws by hand, and then you can rotate this to whatever angle you want. And you can see now I've got the connectors back here. I've got the power and the ground and the O2 sensor that needs to be hooked up. I've taped off the other two that I'm not using right there. And yeah, now we're almost ready to put it into the A-pillar. But before we hook it up, let's go over these last two connectors. We have an in and an out. You can see the out right there on the top. And we'll be using the out to connect that to our laptop. There's a little coupling that comes with it, and we'll attach that to the out, and the in is actually if you want to string another gauge to this. Let's say you have running boost. Let's say you have a turbo or something, you want to connect this gauge to the boost gauge. You can connect as many as you want through that little connector right there. But we're not going to be using that, of course. So now we're ready to wire this thing up. You can see I've already fitted the A pillar back in and run the wires through that. So now we just have to connect these wires up and then pull the wires back through the A pillar. Now I'm going to show you a little trick I used to solder the power and the ground. So I placed my gauge pod right here on this piece of cardboard, which I tucked underneath the rear view mirror right here, and that makes it a little handy table. Then I soldered my ground and my power together right here, and I've got some shrink wrap. I'm going to pull down over that and hit it with my heat gun. Then I'm going to plug up my O2 sensor and my laptop cable, and then I can just pull all that cable right on through the A pillar and down towards the floorboard. Now I'll briefly go over how I mounted the gauge pod to the A pillar, and I did this while the A pillar was out of the car, of course, but you can see this little grommet right here, and it basically it's a 3/16 inch drill bit, and there's 4 of those holes. You put 2 on either end. You can see I've got a nice flush fit right here, but basically these little grommets fit in after you drill a hole through the gauge pod and into the A pillar. And basically what I did was just held my hand on the gauge pod really tight right here, and then drilled this hole and the one on the other side right here, popped my grommets in after that, and then held the rear of the gauge pod down and did the same for the other 2. And yeah, I ended up with a really nice fitment here, and it's very sturdy, it's not loose, so it's a pretty good setup. If you do it correctly, this will not move around. It's very sturdy. So high quality piece of equipment from Z1 Motorsports, and I'll link the product below. Now that we've got the gauge wired and mounted, we can begin the calibration process of the O2 sensor. So I have connected the O2 sensor to the cable that we ran through the firewall. You can see it laying right here in free air, and that's how we're going to calibrate it. It's not going to be installed into the Y pipe till we're done with the calibration. So I've got it all connected here, and we're ready to calibrate. Now once we're done with the calibration process, we can disconnect the O2 sensor and neatly tuck our wiring away, and then we can place it into the Y pipe and reconnect it then. So I'll go over that all in a minute, but now let's go into the calibration process. Now to calibrate the sensor, all we have to do is get into the driver's seat, turn the ignition to the on position, you don't start it, and you can see that it goes into this heater mode. Now this heater mode is just designed to heat the sensor up, so it prolongs the life of the sensor is what it really does, and it gets it preheated so when it gets exposed to exhaust gases, it doesn't damage it and it lasts a lot longer. So you're going to see HTR every time you turn your car on. This is a normal mode that it goes through. But what we're looking for now is for the heater mode to shut off after it heats up the probe. And then we're going to be looking for a value of 22.4. And that is what it should read when it's just laying in open air. And you can see I've got the 22.4. So now we're all set with the calibration, and we can turn the ignition off, disconnect the probe, and do some wire tucking. Before we go over the wire tuck underneath the car, I did want to show you where I connected my ground wire. I didn't go over that earlier, but basically once I ran it through the firewall, I extended the wiring all the way across the engine bay here. You can see I've got it really close to the firewall right here. And then I've run it right along to the battery, and I connected it up to the battery. So I ran it underneath these little plastic panels right here, came down, went around the battery. I'll show you where it looks like right here, down underneath here, and then around this side, and then boom, right back up. You can see it right here is my ground wire, and I've attached it right to the negative battery post, and that is what the instructions recommend. You know, you can also ground it to the body somewhere if you want, if you don't want to run the wire this far. But I decided to go right by the book this time for once. And so I ran it straight to the negative battery cable. Now we're back under the car and I've disconnected the O2 probe from the harness, and I'm going to go ahead and put some anti-seize on this sensor, and we're going to go ahead and we're going to screw this into the Y pipe. You can see that if I would have went any further down the Y pipe, it really wouldn't have fit. So I just barely had enough room right here to screw this thing in and run the wire up into that little tray above it. So this is probably about as far down the Y pipe as you can place the O2 sensor if you're running a stock Y pipe. So now I'm just going to tighten it up, and then we'll start tucking the wires. So at this point you can take a open-end wrench, or I'm using a crescent wrench right here, and I'm just going to snug up my O2 sensor, and once that's snugged up, we can go ahead and start tucking our wire. And you can see right above my hand there's a little covering here that attaches to the bottom of the frame, and that's a nice little area to stow away part of your cable so that it's not exposed to any rocks and debris. And yeah, this should work great to support any excess cable that you have. And then I'm going to zip tie it to the frame right about here. There's a nice little hole that you can just run a zip tie through and zip tie your cable to that. So we're going to zip tie it way above the Y pipe here so that the heat doesn't get to it. Now that we've got the O2 sensor wire attached to the frame, we can go ahead and grab this little coupling from the gauge itself and connect it to the O2 sensor. Of course, I want to keep it way above this Y pipe once again. And you can see right here, there is a subframe brace right here, this black brace right here, and we're going to run it above that brace. I know it's kind of hard to see, but there's quite a bit of room up there, and we can basically run the wires above this brace. We can go ahead and connect the two together, and then we can zip tie them to the subframe brace right here, and that'll keep you really far away from the Y pipe and any heat damage that might occur from being too close to the Y pipe. Now I'm briefly going to talk about the wiring coming from the firewall that we threaded through earlier. I had to run it by the test pipes that I have, and I did have to put some heat shielding up here. So you see this heat shielding right here? I placed this over my cable that came out of the firewall. You can see it's pretty close to my test pipe, and I definitely didn't want that heat rising and cause any damage to the cable, so I've got some heat shielding from AutoZone, and it was pretty cheap, and I just placed it right over that, and then I ran it underneath the factory heat shielding right here. You can see this little thing is a factory heat shield, and then I've run it from underneath this little heat shield, and we talked about this black brace earlier where I zip tied the connection from this cable to the O2 sensor right here, and you can see I've zip tied it right here, and on the other side I put another zip tie to make it very stable, and I'll show you that right here. See the other side, I've zip tied this side too, and then I've run it above my Y pipe up here. And let's get to the other side here. You can see I've attached it to this little support right here and zip tied it as well. And you can see I've run my excess cable into this area that we talked about earlier, this little plastic covering right here. And then I've attached it to my Y pipe right here. There's my O2 sensor. Now that we finished the air-fuel ratio gauge install, I briefly wanted to go over the calibration schedule for you. Of course, we're going to calibrate before we install it, and then we'll recalibrate it after 3 months of use, and then after that it'll just be once a year we'll have to take it out and calibrate it, and that's for a naturally aspirated engine. So now let's take it out for a test run. Okay, good. Here we go. So if this video helped you out, please don't forget to like and subscribe to my channel, and stay tuned for another one. We'll be back very soon. Until then, just keep on repairing.